that the only reason he'd been brought in, cuffed, was to strip him of his dignity. Bitch. That's the worst thing he can imagine. I thought you were going to help me. Sure, Chris said angrily. What would you like me to do? Push you off the chair when the rope's around your neck? Everything has been leading up to this. Before this trial is over, you will know the defendant for what he really is. Beneath that fancy jacket and that nice blue tie, a cold-blooded murderer. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of our book club series. If you're new here and you don't know who I am, my name is Brooke. I have different types of content on my channel. What you are watching right now is a continuation of our book club series. We are reading The Pact by Jodi Picoult. We read chapters of the book together, and then we discuss the characters and the drama and our opinions about what we think might be going to happen. So if you enjoy books and book discussions, then stick around because you will definitely enjoy this type of content. If you want to catch up to where we're at right now in the book and the discussion, I have a playlist on my channel called Book Club The Pact. I will link that up here for you to find that. Or if you prefer to just watch the last few videos leading up to this one and jump in from there, you're welcome to do that as well. However you choose to catch up, we would love to have you join in with us. I always do a quick recap of the last few sentences we read in the last video, just so that everybody is up to speed and we all know what's going on. Other than that, this is reading 22, and I'm gonna go ahead and get started. So last time when we left off, we were at a flashback to when Emily was still alive. All we know is that Chris is going to try to handle this situation with Emily by himself. He has not told anybody because Emily made him promise that he would not tell anybody. So he's going to keep it to himself and try to continue. He's keeping it to himself because he wants her to continue to confide in him so that he can make a plan to get her out of this. So that's where we left off. I'm going to read the last few sentences and then I'm going to move on to the next section. His eyes widened. That was it. Em wanted his understanding and his silence. If he played along, he'd have a chance to talk her out of doing it, even up to the last minute. He'd pretend that this crazy idea of killing herself was acceptable, and then, like a white knight, he'd sweep down and save Emily from herself. No one else would ever have to know what had almost happened, and he wouldn't have to break his promise to her about keeping the whole horrible plan to himself. The ends justified the means. It did not occur to Chris that he might not succeed. Feeling much better, he stood up at the sound of his coach's whistle and sleeked into the pool again for another drill. This is him. He's having all these thoughts. He's like, I'm gonna, step in like a white knight and get her through this. I'm gonna get her out of this. So we are now moving on to the next section. It is still, looks like it's still in the past. It's still at this time frame in the past when Emily is alive. Emily was waiting for him after practice. She stayed late at school too, usually taking up residence at her easel in the art room and finishing in time to meet Chris after swimming so that he could drive her home. She was waiting for him on a chair beside the water fountain outside the boys' locker room, her hands smelling faintly of turpentine and her coat bunched in a heap at her feet, like a lap dog. Hi, Chris said, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder as he crossed to her. He bent down to kiss her cheek, and she breathed him in, that wonderful mixture of Safeguard and chlorine and laundry detergent. His sideburns were still dripping water from his shower. He was close enough that she could put out her tongue to catch a drop. Emily closed her eyes, sketching the picture into her mind so that she would be able to take it with her. She fell into step beside him on the way to the students' parking lot. I've been thinking, Chris began, about what you said Saturday night. Emily nodded, but kept her eyes trained on his shoes. And I want you to know, for the record, that this is like the last thing in the world I want to happen, Chris said. I'm going to do everything I can to change your mind. He took a deep breath and squeezed her hand. But if it comes to that, he said, I would like to be there with you. So we're going to pause here for a second. So he just said, but if it comes to that, I would like to be there with you. So I think he's pretending like he wants to go with her when she does this to herself so that he can stop her from doing it. I think that's the motivation behind what he just said. I guess we don't know. What do y'all think? Put it in the comments. Let me know. Emily realized as he said the words that apparently she had not lost all hope. Not when she'd subconsciously been wishing so hard for this. I'd like that, she said. So maybe she does want him to save her. Did y'all catch that? Is that just me? Is that what I'm thinking? Like, because she's like, it says not when she'd subconsciously been wishing so hard for this. So maybe she does want him to like swoop in and save her or something. I'm not really sure what that comment means. What do you guys think? We are going to move on to the next section now. Chris began a subtle, undeterrable campaign to show Emily what she would be missing. He took her out to restaurants where dinner cost $100. He drove her to watch the sunset over the jetties that glided into the Atlantic. He dug out old notes they'd passed back and forth on a tin-can pulley system that worked exactly 3 times before tangling irreparably in the pines between the houses. He made her look through his stacks of college application materials as if her input was imperative to his decisions. And he made love to her, offering his body in both tenderness and anger, unsure which was the best way to pass her bits of his soul so that she could patch her own with it. And Emily suffered it. That was the best way Chris could describe it, really. She endured whatever he set in her path, but from a distance, as if she were watching from on high and had long ago set her mind. To his astonishment, Emily didn't give an inch. He tried to figure out what her problem was with all the fortitude and strategic delicacy of a general mounting a land invasion. In the wake of her silence, he dreamed of the worst things he could imagine. She was a drug addict. She was a lesbian. That's the worst thing he can imagine. I'm sorry, that was funny. That's really funny. Okay. He dreamed of the worst things he could imagine. She was a drug addict. She was a lesbian. She had cheated on the SATs. All things that would not make him stop loving her. He tried teasing her secret out of her. He tried 20 questions. He tried bullying. It only made Emily tighten her mouth and curl away so that Chris panicked about losing her sooner rather than later. He could only press to a certain point, because if she started to think he wouldn't truly help herself, his charade and his valiant chance to save her would be blown. I can't talk about it, she'd say. You won't, Chris corrected. Frustrated, Emily would say that by bringing it up, Chris was only making it hurt more. If he really loved her, he'd stop asking. And Chris, just as wearied by the stalemate, would shake his head. I can't, he'd tell her. Won't, imperated, shaming him into dropping the subject once again. So I think it says he tried teasing her secret out of her. He tried 20 questions, etc., etc. I think it's talking about her being pregnant. I think that's the secret that it's talking about. Unless it's like her being assaulted as a child, which she also has not told anyone about yet up to this point. So it could be that. What do y'all think? I think it's her pregnancy that he's like trying to get out of her. Okay. Won't, imperated, shaming him into dropping the subject once again. Okay, and we're moving on to the next section. They lay on their bellies in the living room of the Gold House, their math textbooks open in front of them. Derivatives and differential equations curled like a foreign tongue over the pages. No, she said, pointing out a spot where Chris had made an error. It's 2xy minus x, she corrected. Then she rolled onto her back, staring up at the ceiling. Why is it so important to me to get an A, she mused, when I'm not even going to be here to get a report card? She sounded so matter-of-fact about it that Chris felt nauseated. Maybe it's because you don't really want to yourself, he pointed out. Thanks, Dr. Freud, Emily said. I mean it, Chris said, coming up on an elbow. What if we said you'd wait 6 months and see how you felt? Emily's face froze. No, she said. That's it? Just no? She nodded. No. Oh, well, that's great, Chris said, slamming his textbook. That's just wonderful, Em. Emily narrowed her eyes. I thought you were going to help me. Sure, Chris said angrily. What would you like me to do? Push you off the chair when the rope's around your neck? Pull the trigger? Emily's face flushed red. Do you think it's easy for me to talk about? She asked tightly. Because it isn't. It's easier for you than it is for me, Chris exploded. You don't even get where I'm coming from. I look at you and I see this amazing, beautiful thing. All these books and songs are written about people looking for the love of their life and never finding it. And we've got it, and it isn't worth a damn to you. It is worth a damn to me, Emily said, covering Chris's hand with her own. It's the only thing worth a damn. All I'm trying to do is keep it that way, forever. Hell of a way to do it, Chris said bitterly. Really? Emily asked. Would you rather spend the rest of your life thinking about us and remembering it as something totally perfect, or would it be better to let it get all screwed up and have that as your memory? Who said we'd ever get all screwed up? We would, Emily said. It happens. Don't you see? Chris said, trying to keep the tears out of his voice. Don't you understand what you'd be doing to me? I'm not doing it to you, Emily answered softly. I'm doing it for me. Chris stared at her. What, he said, is the difference? Okay, next section. To his surprise, the more Emily brought up the subject of suicide, the less shocking it became. Chris stopped arguing with her about it because that only made her more set in her ways, and he took up a new tack, exploring her options thoroughly so that she might see how completely ludicrous the idea was. He turned to her one night in the middle of a TV movie and asked her how she was going to do it. What? It was the first time Emily had ever heard Chris bring it up. Usually she was the one to broach the topic. You heard me. I figure you must have been thinking it over. Emily shrugged, gave a quick glance over her shoulder to make sure her parents were still upstairs. I have, she said. Not pills. Why not? Because it's too easy to do it wrong, she said. You wind up with your stomach pumped in a psychiatric ward. He rather liked that idea, actually. So, what's your alternative? There's carbon monoxide poisoning, she said, and then smiled. I'd probably have to use your Jeep, and slashing wrists seems deliberate. I think yourself in general is pretty deliberate, Chris said. It might hurt, Emily said meekly. I just want it to be over right away. Chris looked at her. Before you can change your mind, he thought, or I can change it for you. I was thinking of a gun, she said. You hate guns. Well, what does that have to do with it? Where are you going to get a gun? Chris said. Emily looked up at him. Maybe from you, she suggested. His eyebrows raised. Oh no, absolutely not. Please, Chris, she said. You could just give me the key to the cabinet. Tell me where to find the bullets. You're not going to shoot yourself with a hunting rifle, Chris muttered. I was thinking of the little one, the Colt. She saw him put up a wall, and her chest spasmed. Chris had seen that look before, wide and resigned, backed into a corner, like a doe, the moment before he took it down. And he realized that this was Emily now, that the only time she seemed happy was when she was planning the way she would die. Tears were running down her face, thickening his own throat, and making Chris cry the same way her orgasm sometimes triggered his. You used to say you'd do anything for me, Emily pleaded. Chris looked down at their hands, linked over their textbooks, and accepted for the first time that, for whatever reason, he might fail, that this might really happen. I would, he said, his heart breaking beneath the weight of the truth. I feel like I'm about to start crying. Oh my God. Ooh. Oh my God. All right, we're going to move on to the next section. Holy fuck. They sat in the dark of the movie theater, holding hands. Whatever they'd gone to see, Chris couldn't even remember the title, was long finished. The credits had rolled. The other patrons had left. Around them, one or two ushers swept empty popcorn containers out of the aisles, moving in a hushed rhythm and doing their best to ignore the couple still curled in the back of the theater. Sometimes he was certain that he'd come away a hero. One day, he and Emily would find this all very funny. And other times, he believed that he would be only what he'd promised Emily, someone there to witness her as she went. I don't know what I'd do without you, Chris whispered. He could see Emily turn to him, her eyes shine in the dark. You could do it with me, she said, and swallowed, the suggestion still bitter in her throat. Chris did not respond, purposefully letting her feel sick to her stomach at the thought. He wondered silently. What makes you so sure we would still be together after? How do you know it works like that? Because, Emily said as clearly as if she'd heard him, I can't picture it any other way. So she just kind of like read his mind. That was pretty cool. So she's like, we're going to talk about this first. We're pausing here for a second. I don't know what I'd do without you, Chris whispered. He could see Emily turn, blah, blah, blah. She's like, you could do it with me, suggesting that they do it together. The suggestion still bitter in her throat. Chris did not respond, purposely letting her feel sick to her stomach at the thought. So he's just like waiting it out. He's just waiting it out, seeing what she's going to say next. He's like, did you really suggest, in his mind, he's like, did she really just suggest that we do this together? And he's like, I'm just going to let that sink in. I'm not even going to say anything. And then he says in his head, it says, he wondered silently, what makes you so sure we would still be together after? How do you know it works like that? And that's like this thought in his head. And Emily responds, verbally, she says, because, Emily said, as clearly as if she'd heard him, I can't picture it any other way. So she kind of just knew what he was thinking and responded to it. Okay, we are moving on to the next section. One night, he went into the basement and took the key from his father's workbench. The gun cabinet was locked, as always, to keep out children, not teenagers like Chris, who knew better. He opened the cabinet and took out the Colt, because he knew Emily well enough to be certain that the first thing she'd ask was to see the pistol. If he didn't bring it, she'd realize something was up and stop trusting him before he had a chance to keep her from going through with it. Oh my God. So I wonder if this is like the day that it's happening. We don't know yet, but it says he opened the cabinet and took out the Colt because he knew Emily well enough to be certain that the first thing she'd ask was to see the pistol. If he did not bring it, she'd realize something was up and stop trusting him before he had a chance to keep her from going through with it. Wow. So that's why he ends up actually bringing it. What we still don't understand is why there's actually bullets in it. He sat there, the weight of the gun cradled in his hands, remembering the acrid smell of Hops solvent number 9, and the way his father's hands, gifted and precise, had rubbed the shaft and the barrel with a silicone cloth, like Aladdin's lamp, Chris had once thought, expecting magic. He remembered the stories his father had told him about the piece, about Elliot Ness and Al Capone, about the speakeasies and the secret raids and slow gin fizzes. He told Chris that this gun had driven home justice. Then he remembered his first deer hunt, which had not been a clean kill. Chris and his father had tracked the animal into the woods, where it lay on its side, taking great, heaving breaths. "What do I do?" Chris had asked, and his father had lifted his rifle and fired. "Put it out of its misery," he said. He reached into the bottom of the gun cabinet and drew out the bullets for the .45. Emily was no fool. She'd asked to see these too. So that's why he actually brought them. He closed his eyes and made himself imagine her lifting the tarnished silver barrel to her forehead. Made himself picture his own hand coming up and drawing the gun away from her head, if it came down to that. It was selfish, but it was simple. He could not let Emily herself. When you'd been with someone your whole life, you could not imagine living in a world that did not have her in it. He would stop her. He would. And he did not let himself wonder why he'd slipped 2 bullets into his pocket instead of just the one. And he did not let himself wonder why he'd slipped 2 bullets into his pocket instead of just the one. So maybe he's like in denial? Or maybe he's just in a hurry. You never know until you're in a situation. But he's going to get the bullets and the gun, and he puts 2 bullets into his pocket and doesn't really think about it. He just kind of does it. And now we're moving on to the next section. It says May 1998 now. So we're back in the present time where Emily is no longer alive. Gus sat on the edge of her bed and smoothed her pantyhose up her legs. Next, she thought woodenly, clothes. She stepped into the closet to retrieve a simple navy dress and a pair of matching low-heeled pumps. She would wear her pearls, too, elegant and understated. She was not allowed in the courtroom. Witnesses were sequestered until they gave their testimony. In all likelihood, she would not be called to the stand today, maybe not even tomorrow. She was dressing up on the off chance that she might see Chris, even in passing. So Gus is getting ready for the trial? So Gus is getting ready for the trial, and in hopes that she might see Chris, her son. Gus heard the water running in the bathroom as James shaved. It was as if they were going to a dinner party or a conference with one of the children's teachers, except they weren't. And so James emerged from the bathroom to find Gus sitting on the bed in her bra and pantyhose, her eyes closed and her body bent, taking small, shallow breaths as if she'd been running forever. This is jumping around now. Now we're back to Melanie and Michael. Melanie and Michael walked out of the house together. So this must be the first day of the trial, it seems like it's the first day of the trial. And we're getting a glimpse into, like, sort of everybody's perspective. So we're at Melanie and Michael now. Melanie and Michael walked out of the house together. Her feet sank into the soft earth, mucking up her heels. She opened the other door of her car and, without saying a word, got inside. Michael got into his own truck. He followed his wife all the way down Wood Hollow Road, staring at the rear end of her car. There were 2 high brake lights on each side of the wide back window, and a low strip of lights across the bumper of the car as well. Every time Melanie stepped on the brake, they all flashed, making it seem as if the car were smiling. Okay? And now we're going to another section, and so it's a different perspective. Barry Delaney's cat knocked over her cup of coffee. So this is the Attorney General. So this is the prosecution. Barry Delaney's cat knocked over her cup of coffee the minute she was scheduled to leave for the courthouse. Shit, 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 she muttered, pushing the yowling cat away from the mess and soaking it up with a dish towel. It was not enough. The coffee was still running in the rivulets beneath the kitchen table. Barry glanced quickly at the sink, deciding that she did not have time to clean it up. It was not until days later that she realized coffee would stain her white vinyl flooring, that for the next 10 years, she'd come into her kitchen and think about Christopher Hart. Okay, now we're moving on to another section. This one looks like it's Jordan's point of view here, who is Jordan, Chris's lawyer. Jordan set his briefcase down on the kitchen counter. Then he spun around toward Thomas, one hand flattening his tie. So? Thomas whistled. Looking good, he said. Good enough to win? Good enough to kick some ass, his son crowed. Jordan grinned and slapped Thomas on the back. Watch your mouth, he said half-heartedly, and lifted the box of Cocoa Krispies, his face falling. Oh, Thomas, you didn't. His brows drew together as he peered into the dark, empty recesses of the cereal box. Thomas, in the middle of a mouthful, let his jaw drop open. Isn't there some left? I swear, Dad, I thought there was. Every morning before a trial, Jordan had Cocoa Krispies. It was a sorry superstition, one with no more meat to it than a baseball pitcher who didn't shave for consecutive wins, or a card sharp with a rabbit's foot sewn into the lining of his jacket. But it was his superstition. But it was his I did it again. Oh my God. I'm just going to start that whole section over. Every morning before a trial, Jordan had Cocoa Krispies. It was a sorry superstition, one with no more meat to it than a baseball pitcher who didn't shave for consecutive wins, or a card sharp with a rabbit's foot sewn into the lining of his jacket. But it was his superstition, damn it, and it worked. Eat the Krispies, win the trial. Thomas squirmed under his father's glare. I could run out and get some more, he suggested. Jordan snorted. With what vehicle? My bike. So you'll be back in time for, maybe lunch. Jordan shook his head. I just wish, he said, trying to keep his temper in check, that sometimes you'd think before you acted. Thomas stared into his bowl. I could go next door and see if Mrs. Higgins has some. Mrs. Higgins was 75 if she was a day. Jordan highly doubted that Cocoa Krispies was a pantry staple for her. Forget it, he said irritably, reaching into the refrigerator for an English muffin. It's too late. We are moving on to another section here. It felt weird being in a suit. An officer had brought Chris the clothes with his breakfast. The jacket and slacks he hadn't seen since his arraignment 7 months before. By the way, I know how to say the word arraignment now. If you go back and watch the full book club, The Pact playlist, you'll see that I didn't know how to say that word, but I have indeed learned the right way to say arraignment. The jacket and slacks he hadn't seen since his arraignment 7 months before. He remembered when he and Em and his mother had gone shopping for the suit. The store had smelled of money and worsted wool. He stood on the inside of the dressing room booth, hopping around to get pants on, while Em and his mom chattered about ties, their voices coming through the door like the pipe of finches. "Hart," an officer said, standing at the door of the cell. "Time to go." He walked through the pod in his suit, sweat beading at his temples, aware of the conspicuous silence from the occupants of other cells. It hit too close to home was all. You could not watch someone march off to trial without thinking what might happen to you. When the heavy door was locked behind him again, the officer led him to a deputy sheriff, one of several stationed at the Grafton County Courthouse. "Big day," he said, cuffing Chris and then attaching the links to a waist chain. He waited for the officer to unlock the jail's main door and led Chris out of the prison, one hand firmly on his upper arm. It was the first time in 7 months that Chris had stood outside, fenced in only by the mountains and the lazy strip of the Connecticut River. The farm beside the jail reeked of manure. He took a deep breath and lifted his face, the sun soaking his cheeks at the bridge of his nose, his knees buckling under the tentative weight of freedom. "Let's go," the deputy said impatiently, yanking him toward the courthouse. All right, next section. The courtroom was conspicuously empty. Most of the players in the drama had been pulled aside as future witnesses. James sat stiffly in the row of seats just behind the defense table. Sorry, I had a brain fart. James, Chris's dad. James sat stiffly in the row of seats just behind the defense table. Jordan, who had arrived a few minutes earlier, was talking to a colleague, his foot braced up on a chair. He stopped speaking when a side door opened, and James followed his gaze to see Chris being brought inside. A bailiff led Chris to the defense table. James felt his throat close at the sight of his son, and before he could remember himself, he reached over the divider and tried to touch Chris's arm. Chris was directly in front of James, but a foot out of reach. They built it this way, James thought, on purpose. "I don't think so," Jordan was yelling, pointing to the handcuffs, which were horrible but had been expected. In fact, Jordan had been the one to mention it to the Harts, so James didn't see why he was so surprised. He gesticulated wildly, striding with the prosecutor toward the judge's chambers. Chris turned around in his chair. "Dad," he said. James reached out his hand again. For the first time in his life, he was completely oblivious to an entire room of people looking on. He straddled and swung his legs over the divider, sitting down in the chair Jordan had vacated. Then he embraced his son, his body enveloping Chris's so that the reporters and onlookers who poured into the courtroom to ogle the defendant could not even see that he was fettered. All right, next section. In chambers, Jordan exploded. "For God's sake, Your Honor," he said, "while we're at it, why don't I put him in dreadlocks and have him grow a beard? And hell, let's put a skinhead tattoo on his forehead so the jury really forms a bias before we've even started the trial." Barry rolled her eyes. "Your Honor, it's perfectly within precedent to have an alleged murderer brought to trial in handcuffs." Jordan rounded on her. "What do you think he's going to do here? Start hammering someone to death with a Bic pen?" as we know, Barry is the assistant attorney general for the prosecution. So the one prosecuting Chris, right? And then Jordan is Chris's attorney. So their relationship is just funny. It just cracks me up. Hammering someone to death with a Bic pen? He turned to the judge. The only reason for the shackles, as we all know, is to make everyone think he's dangerous. He is dangerous, Barry pointed out in an undertone. He killed a person. Save it for the jury, Jordan muttered beneath his breath. Jesus God, Puckett said, spitting an almond shell into his hand. Is this what I have to look forward to? His lids drifted shut as he rubbed his temples. It may be precedent, Miss Delaney, but I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that Chris Hart isn't planning to go off on a murderous rampage. The defendant can remain uncuffed for the duration of the trial. Thank you, Your Honor, Jordan said. Barry turned, bumping shoulders with Jordan on her way out the door. Must be a pretty feeble defense, she whispered, if you're already begging favors from the bench. Get 'em, Barry. I'm not really invested. I just think it's funny. They just crack me up. Next section. Jordan smiled confidently at Chris, who was still rubbing his wrists. This, he said, nodding down at Chris's newly freed state, is a terrific sign. Chris didn't really see why, since even an honest-to-God murderer would have to be a total idiot to attack someone in the middle of a court of law. He knew, and Jordan knew, hell, everybody knew, that the only reason he'd been brought in, cuffed, was to strip him of his dignity. Don't look at the prosecutor, Jordan continued. She's going to say some awful things. You are allowed to do that in an opening argument. Ignore her. Ignore her, Chris repeated dutifully. And then some skinny guy with an Adam's apple as big as an egg told everyone to rise. The Honorable Leslie F. Puckett presiding, he announced, and a man in a flowing robe entered from a side door, his teeth cracking audibly against something. Be seated, the judge said, opening a file. He plucked a nut out of a squat, square jar in front of him, and sucked it through his lips, like krill being drawn through a whale's baleen. The prosecution, he said, may begin. Oh my God, I'm so excited. Go down, I'm excited. Are you guys excited? Like, we've been waiting for this. This is reading number 22. We're 22 readings in, and the trial is finally starting right now. This is big. Everything has been leading up to this. Barry Delaney stood up and faced the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, my name is Barry Delaney, and I'm here to represent the state of New Hampshire. I want to thank each one of you for taking on a very important job. The 12 of you are here to make sure that justice is done in this courtroom. And in this case, justice means that you will find that man, she raised a finger and pointed, Christopher Hart, guilty of murder. Yes, murder. It does sound shocking, and it's probably even more shocking to you that I'm pointing at a good-looking young man. I bet you're even thinking, he doesn't look like a murderer. She turned to examine Chris with the other members of the jury. He looks like, well, a prep school kid. He doesn't fit the Hollywood image of a murderer. But ladies and gentlemen, this isn't Hollywood. This is real life. And in real life, Christopher Hart killed Emily Gold. Before this trial is over, you will know the defendant for what he really is. Beneath that fancy jacket and that nice blue tie, a cold-blooded murderer. Shit's getting intense. Okay. I'm like sweating right now. Woo! She flicked a glance toward Jordan. There it is again. They're so funny. I like this book. I'm enjoying this book. I know you guys are too. She flicked a glance toward Jordan. Bitch. The defense is going to try to play on your emotions and tell you that this was a botched double suicide. That's not what happened. Let me tell you what did. She turned around, her hands spread on the rail of the jury box, directing her attention at an elderly, blue-haired woman in a flowered cotton dress. On the night of November 7th, at 6 p.m., Chris Hart went into the locked gun chest in the basement of his house and took out a Colt .45 revolver. He put it in his coat pocket and picked up his girlfriend, Emily. He took her to the carousel on Tidewater Road. The defendant also brought liquor. He and Emily drank, had sex, and then, while the defendant still had Emily in his arms, he took out the gun. After a brief struggle, Christopher Hart put the barrel of that revolver up to Emily's right temple and shot her. She paused, letting that sink in. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll hear from Detective Anne Marie Marone. She will tell you that we have the gun, with the defendant's fingerprints all over it. You'll hear the county medical examiner say that the angle of the wound would make it virtually impossible for Emily to have pulled the trigger herself. You'll hear from a jeweler in town that Emily had bought a $500 watch to give to Chris for his birthday, which was the month after she died. And both a friend of Emily's and her own mother will tell you that Emily was not suicidal. You'll also hear Christopher Hart's motive. Why on earth he would have shot his girlfriend. You see, ladies and gentlemen, Emily was 11 weeks pregnant. Sorry, I had to, because that hasn't come out yet. So this is coming out in the trial scandalous! You see, ladies and gentlemen, Emily was 11 weeks pregnant. At the quiet gasp of a juror, Barry hid a smile. This bitch. Barry hid a smile. This young man had big plans for his future and didn't need a baby or a high school sweetheart ruining them. So he decided to, quite literally, get rid of the problem. She stepped back from the jury box. The defendant is charged with murder in the first degree. A person is guilty of first-degree murder when he purposefully causes the death of another, and when his actions toward that end are premeditated and deliberate. Did Christopher Hart kill Emily Gold on purpose? Absolutely. Were his actions that night premeditated and deliberate? Absolutely. She turned on her heel, her cold green eyes pinning Chris's. In the Bible, ladies and gentlemen, the devil comes in many disguises. Don't let his latest one fool you. Nice speech, Miss Delaney did a fine job, didn't she? Jordan stood and sauntered toward the jury. Unfortunately, she was right about only one thing, the fact that Emily Gold is dead. He spread his hands. That is a tragedy, and I'm here to make sure that you don't allow another tragedy to occur, that you don't let this young man get put away for a crime he did not commit. Imagine for a moment the terrible pain of losing a loved one. It's happened to you, Jordan said, looking at the same blue-haired lady Delaney had singled out. And you, he said to a dairy farmer, with a face so creased it seemed again smooth. We've all lost someone, and recently, Chris did too. Think of how you felt when it happened to you. The pain, the rawness of it, and then imagine the horror of being charged with that same person's murder. The state says that Christopher Hart committed murder, but that's not what happened. He almost committed suicide. He watched his girlfriend do it, then fainted before he could do it himself. All of the evidence that the state was talking about is consistent with a double suicide. I'm not going to bore you with contradictions. I'm just going to ask you now to listen very carefully to all the witnesses and look very carefully at all the evidence, because everything the state is using as a proof of murder has been twisted. Ladies and gentlemen, in order to find Chris Hart guilty of murder, you have to be convinced beyond reasonable doubt that the scene Miss Delaney painted for you was the real one. But that's all the state has. A painted scene. He walked back to the defense table and placed his hand on his client's shoulder. When this trial is finished, you'll have more than a reasonable doubt, and you'll know that this is not about murder. Emily Gold wanted to kill herself, and Chris decided to join her. He loved Emily so much that life wasn't worth living without her. Jordan shook his head and turned towards Chris. That's not a crime, ladies and gentlemen. That's a tragedy. Ooh, this is getting good. It's the first day of the trial, and it's already starting off with a bang. Things are getting really excited, so I'm going to end today's reading there. What do you guys think? Who are your favorite characters? Who do you relate to? What do you think is about to happen? Put it in the comments. If you want to keep watching, I will link the next book club video up here for you, so you can click on that if you want to keep watching. I love you guys. I love that you enjoy this as much as I do. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Tap the like and subscribe buttons and have a wonderful day.
How y'all feel out there?
I'm light years, call me eons. When the snare kick in, the beat is neon. Lights, yeah, I'm feeling magnificent. Care less what I'm up against.